Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's 2 o'clock sharp, and we will start with our discussion. And I hope that quite a few people will also be online. I think that we should have at least as many people online as we have here in this meeting group. And this is in fact a very special day and a very special event. Why? Because we have the pleasure to benefit of the presence of the family of the Elman Foundation, not the family, but the whole management or part of the management of the Elman Foundation. And in our panel, we have Ilwad Elman, who is the Director of Programs. In the meeting room, we also have Fartoun Elman, who is the Director and who, of course, will also intervene from the floor during our discussions. And we have, of course, also colleagues who have made the journey to Brussels. Why? Because the Elman Peace Center will be the next winner, is the current new winner, you could say, of the King Baudouin Africa Prize. And the ceremony of that Africa Prize will take place on Thursday in the Belgian Royal Palace. And so this is the reason why we felt that we should bring a country to the attention of the Brussels scene and the Brussels institutions, a country that has been a little bit out of the publicity in recent years, and definitely in recent weeks and months we have been talking a lot about Ukraine. But Somalia is, of course, still there after several decades of insecurity and several decades of problems. There's also interesting signs of hope. We've just had elections in Somalia. There's a whole range of promising initiatives taking place, but all this happens in a context of crisis in terms of climate, in terms of food security, also affected by the Ukraine war, by the way, because 90% of the imports of wheat for Somalia is coming from Ukraine and from Russia. So all this has major implications. I'm not even mentioning the energy and other dimensions of this problem, but this is the reality in which we are today. And this is, of course, a good opportunity to have a discussion with 4 people who know Somalia well and who all have different experiences with the situation in Somalia. And on my right-hand side, we have Ilwad Elman, as I just said, the Director of Programs of the Elman Foundation. She will be able to tell you more about this because we will give her an opportunity to explain what the Elman Center is doing in Mogadishu under very different circumstances, and not only in Mogadishu, by the way, also in different other parts of Somalia. And then as another speaker on my far right, we have Nicolas Berlanga, who is now advisor to the Africa Department of the European External Action Service here in Brussels, but who has been the ambassador of the European Union to Mogadishu, to Somalia. So also someone who has a lot of experience with the Somali context. And he will definitely also be invited to talk a little bit about the role of the Brussels EU institutions in supporting processes in Somalia that are promising for the future in Somalia, but also in the Horn of Africa. And then to my left side, for you right side, far left, we have Stijn Vercruysse. Stijn Vercruysse is a Belgian-Flemish TV reporter who is just back from Somalia. I should say he's just back from DRC because he was in DRC until yesterday with the Belgian royal family, with the king and the queen, where he has been reporting quite a historic visit of the Belgian king to DRC. But before that, only 1 week before your visit to DRC, you were in Somalia, in different places in Somalia. And so you can also give us some life stories about what you have been experiencing yourself, particularly from the angle of the food security situation, because that was one of the key elements of the focus of your visit. And then to my left, my dear colleague Lidet Tadesse from Ethiopia. associate director at ECDPM, dealing with our peace and governance work. And Lidet has a long-standing experience in the Horn of Africa, but also in Somalia. You have been to Somalia yourself, and you have a lot of networks as well who are reporting on Somalia, and very important as well, ECDPM at this very moment is also undertaking an evaluation of the EU programs in support of Somalia. So this is a work in progress, and maybe you could also already inform us about this. So this is the context in which we will discuss today. And I would invite our panel to be quite concise. I will put some particular questions to all of you, because we should also give an occasion to all of you to intervene and to put your questions. So we have 45 minutes of discussion, and then we will ask you to come forward with your own questions, but also just observations. And this should be a very informal type of interaction. It should not be a one-sided question and answer session. Also here around this table, don't be afraid to take the floor, to ask the floor, and to also intervene or to contradict your people here around this table. This is part of the discussion. And I would like to start with Ilwad. The first question that I had was in fact a question on the political situation in Somalia. We talk a lot about Somalia in terms of crisis, insecurity, all types of clans fighting, al-Shabaab. Now, recently, we talk a lot about drought, about the fact that there is a major food security crisis in the making. But at the same time, on the 15th of May, we also had elections, which happened relatively peacefully, with a president who has been re-elected even, first time in the history that a president has been re-elected in Somalia, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed. So there's also signs of hope, there's also signs of change in the country. And the question that I would have to you is, how do you perceive, what are the prospects at this very moment for peace and stability and economic recovery in Somalia? Can you give us a little bit your own impressions on how you see the situation of the country evolving?
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's an honor to be here with you all. And I'd like to first acknowledge all of the team from KBF for this extreme honor of recognizing the Elman Peace Center as 2022 laureates of this prestigious award, and to all of you for actually coming to this forum specifically dedicated to Somalia. And I think that the KBF team have been very intentional on curating a lot of opportunities for us to not just be recognized and awarded this prestigious recognition, but also to really influence a community of actors, of practitioners, of experts and diplomats that are gathered here today and that we've been meeting with and will continue to meet with over the week, to put our priorities and to maybe elevate the local reality of what we see in Somalia to what may not be translated here in Brussels. So it's a great question to begin what hopefully will be a dialogue. From my personal perspective, and I think it is one that is shared amongst many Somali people, is that there's a lot of hope right now and momentum for changing the systems that have been in place in Somalia. And that hope comes from not necessarily the president that has been elected or selected, because we don't have democracy yet, but that the transition was peaceful. But there was a very close possibility of political violence. And there's a lot of lessons that we learned in the last 5 years of the role that we as civil society organizations, as the community at large, who are systemically excluded from political processes, from influencing legislation, on what we need to do and how we need the EU and other actors to better support the community to actually monitor, hold government to account. And I think that with this new president, who's a foreign president, the momentum and hope that exists is that he will be more legacy driven, maybe more politically mature, cognizant and aware of the many challenges in the shrinking civil society space that we experienced over the last 5 years. And we already see now, before his inauguration happened, taking quick action on rebuilding trust at the federal member states levels, engaging different communities, being accessible. So the opportunity that exists right now is a community that wants to hold its government to account. From the international community perspective, this is the time to support Somalia. We are in a very fragile state where it could tip either way, not just because of the humanitarian crisis that we're facing, or the looming famine, or the peace and security issues, but also you still have supporters of the last administration that could spoil the peace that is within reach now more than ever before. And support from the EU community in a country that has been in a protracted conflict will be instrumental. So, and I think, we have a lot of experts on this very distinguished table that can speak to it more, but from my perspective, the biggest failing from the international community, if I can already begin to provoke a little bit, is that there was a singular focus on institutions, on supporting the government over the last 5 years. And there wasn't a parallel investment in civil society, on movement building, on empowering communities, on civic education, on voters' rights, on how to actually engage with legislation and hold their constituents and their members of parliament to account. And that's what we can do now, so that we will not be blindsided in 4 years from now.
Thank you, Ilwad. A positive story. Let's listen to some of the other experts here around the table. Stijn, you're just back from Somalia. Of course, you did not spend most of your time in Mogadishu, but you were on the countryside, where you also brought some sometimes quite telling stories to the media in Belgium. What is your perception? Do you subscribe to what Ilwad is saying?
Yes, I do. First of all, let me say I'm very honored to be in this panel, to be with all of you here. And I don't know Somalia well. I was there 3 times. First time in 2011, that was 1 day. Second time, 2017, that was 1 week. And now 5 days. So the Ukraine crisis also has an impact on VRT, on my media organization, because all the money is going to the journalists going to Ukraine, and I had to limit my time in Somalia. But in these 3 times, I saw the security situation improving. And that is talking from my point of view as a journalist. In 2011, I went into Somalia from Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, and was only able to be there for a few hours, let's say 5 hours, and had to drive back. It was in Doble. And it was impossible for humanitarian organizations, expats, and also for journalists to go to Mogadishu or to go into Somalia because of the threat of al-Shabaab. In 2017, another food crisis was evolving. I was able to fly to Mogadishu for the first time with Turkish Airlines, with a commercial flight. So that was new. In 2011, you could only go fly into Mogadishu with UN flights from Nairobi, for example. Within Mogadishu, it was very, very hard to work. We had to hire an armed car and an escort, private security escort, to drive around the city. We wanted to go to an IDP camp, but that was cancelled at the last moment because of security reasons. And now in 2022, there were 3 airlines, I think, from Brussels that I could choose to fly into Mogadishu. We could stay in Mogadishu. We also had to hire an armed car and security guards, but we could stay a little bit longer. And the places we chose, for example, we went to a market, we went to an old IDP site in side to Mogadishu. We went to the hospital, and we could stay there for more than an hour before we had to leave again. Before it was only 15 minutes and get out, film something, do an interview, get in the car again. In Baidoa, the same. We could easily go to Baidoa and work there in Baidoa. When you go further to the north, it's even easier for us to work with. So the security situation, from my point of view, has definitely improved, I think. I spoke with a lot of local organizations in Baidoa and in Mogadishu, would independently work and interview them. And I saw also a lot of hope there. They have the means and the people to do the work they have to do. In my case, it was focused on humanitarian work in the hospitals, in the IDP camps, for the community. For example, water, wash, as they call in humanitarian language. The only problem they had was during this humanitarian crisis that they don't have the supplies and the money to do it. They have the people, they have the talent, they have everything that's needed. They know the situation on the ground much better than the expats and international organizations who want to help. But the money isn't trusted in their hands. And that was what struck me. I was talking to a doctor in Baidoa who had the problem that he had a big influx of IDPs with severely malnourished children coming to a screening center. And he had to limit the amount of beneficiaries because of a lack of money. So he said, I can help everyone here, but I don't have the money. I don't have enough plum peanuts to give to the children. And it was UNICEF providing him the plum peanuts and other organizations. But the problem they have is, or he has with them, they give them limited contracts for 6 months, for example, and no long-term contracts where you provide money that they choose what they do with it for a long term. And the reason for that was that a lot of donors have conditions when they give money to a certain organization like UNICEF. And they have, one of these conditions is don't give too much money to the local organizations, to say it very simple. And he was waiting for a new contract and for more supplies. And we saw that everywhere, that they had everything to help the people, but didn't have the means. On the other hand, these international organizations who provide them these supplies, and they had the problem of a lack of money from the donors. A country like Germany shifted their money from Somalia to Ukraine, for example. And the problem is that from the budget they need now, if you take all the organizations together, I think only in Somalia 4.6% is funded right now. So, which is much less than in 2017 at the same time, when they could, or they succeeded in there was no famine in 2017. Because of that, there was enough help. And now the problem is there is not enough help because a lot of this is distracted to Ukraine.
I see Nicolas, who would like to come in already at this stage. Please, Nicolas.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And sorry for being a little bit rude and politically incorrect, even if I'm supposed to be the one using the more diplomatic language. In fact, I think the main lesson we can get from Elman Foundation work and for what we are doing today, the main lesson is we need to break the perception that it is extracted by the media journalism these days about Somalia. I mean, I'm not saying that what you saw was not correct. It's totally correct, and even worse. But what I'm saying is that the main features of Somalia these days is like a country with a political struggle about among elites and trying to go and move forward in a normal way. And in some way, even election, you said, Geert, they were relatively peaceful. They were peaceful, the president. I think they were peaceful. I think personally that the presidential election was an election, contrary to the parliamentary election, was a selection. I mean, the problem in Somalia is that the political system is hijacked by the political agreement achieved at the beginning of the century that was a short-term solution to the crisis. But now, 20 years after, they don't manage to. Those people that at that moment were allocated the power to select member of parliament, now, even with the pressure from the civil society or pressure from the national community, they don't want to get rid of that. They don't want to concede that that power and give it to the people. And the political participation, as it was said, I think. But if you look to the situation in Ethiopia, and I'm sure that our colleague in the panel will say more, it is a little bit, has some parallelism, short-term solutions to go out of a crisis in the 90s, that now, after some time, after some decades, you get trapped in a situation without the possibility to give more participation to the people. So the problem, of course, I mean, it is very serious. I mean, COVID, famine, drought, but the real problem is government. And the real problem, and I totally support what said, is political participation. And I have to say also that as ambassador of the European Union from June 2019 to September 2021, I recognize publicly, I think we did a mistake at some moment in October or November 2020 when we conceded again to keep this system and not the one person, one vote, because we thought that security should prevail over stability. But it was the possibility we have at that moment, and the process eventually went well, or at least it went well. As Ilwad said, now there are a momentum of hope, momentum of optimism. Let's say that this momentum of hope, or this momentum of optimism, always happens at the beginning of administration in Somalia, but also everywhere, but in Somalia in particular. So it is the time really now to put pressure. At least this is what I think I have suggested to the EU and others. And it is now the time to engage with the authorities, because at that initial moment they will be more open to compromise. But also the last administration did, we reached a compromise and agreement that some years later were not on. So this is how it is. I truly believe what Ilwad says about the civil society keeping identified. I may disagree a little bit about the support to the civil society. I mean, international partners should work, should try to reinforce institutions. We know the long-term investment institution, but of course not diverting energies and resources to the civil society. And you are a very good example, and I hope that in some way you act as a loud speaker for other civil society organizations that are working very well. Last comment, for the moment there is no evidence that aid supposed to go to Africa in general has been diverted to Ukraine, not at least at EU level. That may happen. We never know. You know the political situation. But I can tell you, working at the African Department at this moment, for the moment, they have not been this kind of diversion. And we are keeping an attentive eye as well. But of course, this is a political decision.
Maybe that's a bit early to see the trend already. Yeah, it could still be there in half a year that you really will see the trend of the shift that is possibly going to take place towards Eastern Europe, away from Africa. But we will see where we end in the next months to come. Let's ask Lidet what your perception is of the evolutions in Somalia, in the Horn of Africa. We hear that it is essentially a story of hope, story of engagement, but also a story of governance that was raised. How do you see the evolutions at this very moment? So, yeah.
Thanks, Geert, and a pleasure to be here with all of you panelists and also audience. To respond to your question, Geert, I think It's also important to look at Somalia as a country that is undergoing not just political transformation, but also economic transformation, reconstruction, social construction, and reconstruction. And it's also a country that is undergoing all of these things at the same time, so not in a sequenced manner. And when I think about governance, of course, higher level, national level, or federal level, elite bargains are important. For the same reasons that Ilwad mentioned earlier about the potentials of, for example, the previous election turning violent, which it didn't. But on the other hand, for a lot of Somalis, the cause for concern, especially security-wise, also comes from local conflicts that are interrelated with national level political settlements or the lack thereof, but also have to do with just simple things that people living in a society face. So resource sharing, for example, grazing lands, livestock. So a lot of other local factors exist. And I think it's important to look into local conflicts as an important aspect of the security or the conflict complex in Somalia, because I think it's in addressing these local conflicts and local concerns that eventually we would also be able to unpack the national level ones. And speaking of governance, I think that's also where the potential for improving the lives of individuals is. I mean, it's one thing to reconstruct a country politically, and I think a lot of resources and a lot of political energy has been spent on, for example, establishing the federal government. I think it's important for the representation of Somalia at international fora as well, that there is a central authority. However, I think going forward, I think where there's a lot of potential to strengthen governance in Somalia is also at the regional level and at the very local level. So the capacity, so the bureaucratic capacity and ability to deliver services of the federal member states is still limited. It's far more limited than the federal authorities, for example. But perhaps in pushing that, then one can ensure citizens could get the services that they need. But the local level is also interesting because you have other systems of governance like the clan elders, for example, which are still recognized as legitimate authorities. They have their flaws, of course, but are still important and key actors when it comes to resolving local conflicts. So I very much support Ilwad when she talks about focusing on civil society organizations and not just those that are based in Mogadishu, the national ones, the big ones that could turn in a lot of money, can forge partnerships with the UNICEFs, but also others that are actually rooted in their community and are doing very important work. And sometimes actually they do it on their own. They mobilize the private sector in Somalia to do work, even when they don't get external assistance. So I think identifying which those ones are and supplementing their work, I think helps the society in general, but I think also helps the reconstruction of Somalia because Somalis themselves are very innovative, and it's like they have diaspora networks, clan networks, and private sector networks. They have there are people that feel social obligation to the communities they come from, and a lot of it I think could be leveraged. I mean, they've already doing it with COVID response. We have seen Somalis themselves mobilizing on social media, on other platforms to self-help, which is what they are really good at doing. So I think it's about identifying those, going very local, going beyond the usual suspects to identify interesting initiatives.
Thanks. And this brings us almost automatically in the second part of our discussion, because I would like to go back now to Ilwad. What you said is reconstruction of the central state is important, but don't forget the local levels, don't forget the regional levels, don't forget what could be done at the level of civil society. And maybe I would like to invite Ilwad at this moment to explain a little bit more what you are doing with the Elman Peace Center, what your key focus of work is, and how the Elman Center is one of the probably many initiatives in Somalia that is at this moment making use of the momentum that has been created in recent times. Please.
Thank you. Maybe before I begin to speak more in depth about the Elman Peace Center and our approach, I'd like to respond to just a few of the remarks from
Of course,
our
everyone
fellow
can
panelists.
respond to each other. Eh?
Thank you. I think there is funding challenges in Somalia for critical issues on health, child protection. We work with children in armed conflict, and we have negotiated for many years with various governments, from the transitional federal government to other administrations, to finally put in place a standard operating procedure in partnership with UNICEF, so that any child that is either captured or surrenders at the front lines can be handed over to us within 72 hours and goes to our programs. But sometimes we go into a funding gap for 2 years or 1 year, navigating the process. But we will never turn away a child that the government willingly hands over, because then that feeds into the discourse that there isn't the capacity, there aren't institutions. So certain things should have earmarked funding. Safety, interim care centers, rehabilitation, support for children leaving and exiting armed groups, health, these should be planned for on long term. And I also want to challenge a bit more on to your point that when I think about Elman Peace and the work that we do and the vital service that we offer, that we've been doing for 30 years, we still see as interim. The goal is for the government to facilitate these services, to offer these social services. And we're starting to, and we have been exploring ways on working with the government more strongly and, sharing experiences. But success to us is a government that is able to care for its society, create an enabling environment that is safe, that is just, and that can be held accountable. And until we have that, we, in the face of many risks, provide the services right now while still working with the government, and we intend to with the incoming government as well too. So I think that to Lidet's point about also really focusing on working at the regional level, I think that there's definitely value in that, and we do that. We have offices in all of the federal member states, except for in the north in Somaliland. And sometimes it's easier to work with a federal member state directly because they function as a semi-autonomous state. But that's not the I think vision that we would like for a unified, centralized Somalia, where there is some sort of cooperation, coordination, and that civil society organizations or individuals don't have to go through the same process in every single region, because it's one country, right? So I think that there should be support to the federal member states, but also finding ways to really harmonize and create stronger partnerships. And it's encouraging to see already that the incoming president has taken it on to start to do that tour, to build and rebuild those relationships. So to get back to the Elman Peace Center and to share a little bit about our approach, where most organizations, I think, start as, developing their constitution and their bylaws and, becoming an organization and registering. The Elman Peace Center was started by an individual, two individuals, my parents, ardent peace and human rights activists and social entrepreneurs before the war, and used their for-profit resources to support marginalized communities, children and youth that were orphaned or had substance abuse problems, and then later, as the conflict ensued, switched their focus on intentionally disarming and demobilizing and reintegrating young people with alternative dignified livelihoods through their businesses. So the goal from the beginning has always been looking at sustainable solutions. And because he was so effective in creating a pipeline out of armed conflict, a viable, clear, new trajectory for young people, he unfortunately was killed for the work that he was doing. But 25 years later on, the same recipe still applies. And the same approach is what we're using right now in Somalia on building peace. We're not investing only in political peace. We think that there's different actors that are better placed to do so and have a mandate to do so. And we want to inform and be a part of that process, but we focus our work on social peace, and that is at the community level. So even in our work on reintegration, we work with people that are actively engaged in armed groups through our alumni, people that have gone through our programs that have access to them. We work with credible thought leaders that are in the community, not necessarily recognized as clan leaders, but have influence and the ability to actually create a pathway out. We empower young people through providing skills, free education, sustainable opportunities, not quick impact interventions. We build infrastructure, we build schools, we create businesses to support those schools so that we don't just create an entry point for education for a young girl for 6 months and then no longer have funding available and then she drops out. So we're looking at how can we have revolving funding for civil society organizations that pilots new ideas that can be sustainable and sustained by the community, because that potential does exist. Civil society and community-based actors like us are invested in Somalia for the long haul and will continue to provide support to our community with or without funding, but with partnerships directly with the EU and creating or dismantling barriers for participation. We can collectively amplify and expedite the progress and the peace that's within reach. So some of our cornerstone programs are investing in vocational and technical education, recognizing that education is still 100% privatized in Somalia. And even for those that can afford it, the curriculum that they learn, often you'll have bachelor degrees, master student degrees. The workforce, it does not absorb them because it's still employers' behaviors need to be changed. So when we design our skills that we offer at the vocational training centers, it's informed by the business community. What do they need a workforce for? And they actually hire our graduates, and they don't give a certificate just for participating. And we've been able to change employers' behavior on how they hire and dismantle tribalism and nepotism, but looking at hiring someone based on merit. And I think there's successful models like that that can be scaled, but there's a limitation to that. If we had more support from EU countries like Germany that invest in TVET significantly in building facilities that can actually harness the demographic dividend that exists in Somalia and this overwhelming majority of youth that can both contribute to the massive post-conflict reconstruction needs and also alleviate the massive youth unemployment issue that feeds their vulnerability into armed groups, that this is something that I think is a key priority for us. And I do want to give someone else the floor, but I would like to also just highlight that with this recognition of the KBF Foundation and the grant that comes with it, I want to raise why it's also important, not just because it's funding, but also donor behaviors need to change a little bit about the things that they want to fund. And with grants like this, we have an opportunity to ideate, what do we really need as an institution? What is actually going to help us help our community better? So when we start to think about what are we going to do with this grant, 200,000 euros that comes with the prize, we sort of think about the things that we can never get funding for, that are considered boxes that you tick after war, that are considered too lofty or luxuries. And what we're talking about is mental health of peace building practitioners. How do we support people that are the front lines to actually have adequate support, to be the best versions of themselves, to have access to treatment, to replenish their own cup? And how can they be trusted to lead psychosocial support programs for other traumatized members of the community if they themselves don't have that access? This is from firsthand experience myself. there is no PTSD in Somalia. We are in a constant cycle of trauma. And I think that the idea that investing in local actors and organizations and their institutional growth and their individual development is not prioritized, but you count on them to deliver programs is the shift that we want to see as well too. And we try to do that with our work.
We're coming back to that in a minute, because that's the question on how the EU and also other players can play a role in supporting locally embedded initiatives. But I had a particular question to you. How did you manage in a polarized society to keep up the trust of all the different types of players? That's not evident. We have now a shift of government, shift of president. Will this complicate your life, or is this something that will help you? How come that there is this type of trust that is quite universally spread throughout the country, in spite of all the tragedies that we have gone through, also at family level? How can you explain that?
I think the easiest way to say it is because we lead with the things that we are for and not necessarily the things that we are against. So cooperation with government has always been a priority for us, and cooperation with different community leaders and thought leaders, it's uniting around shared priorities and not necessarily trying to change things in the community by leading with things that we are against. And when we find that commonality, cooperation and partnerships are a lot easier. And I think that we also benefit from sharing the same hardships as our community. We're based in Mogadishu, and we've dedicated our lives to our work, and many others have as well too. But I think that the unwavering amidst extreme tragedy builds trust, and being accessible and decentralizing and being equal in everywhere that we go, and actually trying to deliver a standard of service, because this is not just an organization, it's really a new set of values and ethos that we want to scale throughout the country. And we see that there's a lot of momentum for it if you just create the space for it. So
this brings me to a question to Nicolas. As former EU ambassador, how difficult or how easy was it for you within the EU system to provide support to organizations that are similar to the Elman Peace Center and others, because there's a whole range of other players as well in civil society in Somalia? Are your systems adapted to the realities that have been described by Ilwad?
Well, this is a difficult question, but
we always say this is Chatham House, but of course,
no, yeah, there is no Chatham House these days. Well, I mean, the EU procedures are difficult. In Somalia, in other countries, we have more flexibility. In fact, the EU ambassador as what we call authorizing officer, because of the emergency situation, call it like that. It is not only Somalia, there are other countries in Africa and elsewhere. We have more capacity to overcome some of these procedures and go direct to for implementing projects. But I think as EU, we are probably one of the leading partners in terms of working with the civil society in general, and also in terms of development aid. Ilwad was talking about vocational training, mentioned Germany, but I don't know, probably you don't know that the funds from Germany are coming from the European Union. I mean, it is a joint initiative implemented by GIZ. So, but I would like to come back again to the governance issue. I mean, until Somalia, the Somali people themselves, they don't get this kind of stability, basic stability in terms of security, al-Shabaab, of course, and basic political stability means some kind of system in which the people may gradually participate more in the decision making. Until they don't get that, all the money, all the influence, all the policy dialogue, political dialogue you may have will not be effective. So the key is really at the Somali hands. And I would like to tell you that we cannot forget which kind of culture is Somali culture. I mean, even if it is a sedentarized society these days, and the action of the government is more or less focused on the 20-something towns that are more or less peaceful, or that can be visited, and there are some kind of institution there, but the culture still is a nomadic culture. A culture in which they have never expected anything from the institutions. They have never been, nobody has turned to the state waiting for social services. So the role of Elman's work as others is key, is very important. But there is this issue of balance that I think Ilwad you mentioned, to find the balance about how to reinforce institutions, but at the same time cover the urgent needs. And for that, nobody's a better service provider than organizations like yours. So this is how, and we the EU, we try to be attentive, but let's do not forget one thing. Most of the local organizations that may receive funds do not have the management capacity to receive those funds. That's a little bit what you were saying. It means when you talk about managing €500,000 public money coming from the EU or from other donors, you need to have an administration to do that, and later on to be able to respond to this. Ilwad and others, they had that capacity, but most of the organizations do not. So this is an additional problem. As EU ambassador, I was not 100% comfortable, for example, and please, I hope that this is Chatham House, of the percentage of our aid that was channeled through UN organizations. Because there are UN organizations, there is a wide variety, diversity of organizations. Some are more effective than others, some are more present in the country than others. So sometimes we reach a level in which you contracted or you gave the implementation of big projects to organizations that were not present in Somalia, were present probably in Nairobi. And those organizations had their local counterparts. But in fact, they rarely visited those counterparts. So in fact, they rely on what the local counterparts were telling them. And because of this fragmentation of power, this conflict of interest at all levels, local, federal member state, and federal level, it was very difficult to know what was true or not. You know, it's just to tell you the complexity of the situation in which we work, and also in particular coming from institutions like the EU, using public money that needs to be later well monitored. So this is the situation. Only a final word on local mediation, very important one. And I have to pay homage to one person very close to the Elman family, doing a wonderful work, which is, and for example, with our support, he did a wonderful job. Merca, it completely divided society, and now is emerging again as a town again. And it was thanks to one of these local mediator people that very patient, in a very gentle way, do the work.
Thank you. I retain from what you said the enormous complexity, but also maybe a little bit the chicken and egg situation. On the one hand, enormous resources are needed to remedy a whole range of problems, which are even aggravated now with the drought and food crisis. On the other hand, there is this request to be accountable and to be relatively well established to manage the resources, which is not necessarily a given in the context in which we are in Somalia. Maybe a question to Lidet, because you are evaluating the EU aid to Somalia, and probably you cannot yet preempt on this. This is just the initial stages, but from your own experiences, what is it that the EU could do probably better in these types of crisis contexts? Are there any suggestions that you could give not only to the EU, to the international community? What is it that could be specifically done? What lessons can we learn from these types of situations, maybe from other regions in the world? What are your suggestions?
Yeah, because we were talking a bit about bureaucracy, I'll start from that and then build up to what I think could be done at the political level. As Nicolas mentioned, one of the barriers, and Stijn, he also mentioned, one of the barriers for local organizations is that they're not able to tap to these resources that are channeled. Part of it has to do with indeed the fact that they cannot process that amount of money. So their interventions are at a smaller scale, while the EU grants are, for example, at a larger scale. And in the interim, a lot of organizations do partner with bigger, either international organizations that can manage the fund, because that's also evaluated when organizations and consortiums apply for funds, right? Your track record is seen. So in my previous experience, some Somali peacebuilding organizations, because that's where my experience is, were partnering with international peacebuilding organizations that they have worked with, and then could provide all of these administrative documentation, so that the interventions could be done. Recently, I also came across the EU sort of making headway in availing resources for community-based organizations, and including institutional funding for community-based organizations, because that's also another challenge. As a community-based organization, you would want to establish yourself as an institution in addition to the funds that you want to get in order to implement projects. But as a researcher, I would also have to talk about what it means when a local organization is sort of forced or incentivized to partner with bigger international organizations. As I said, for now, I mean, so many good examples on how this is working. But I think this puts back a question around bureaucracy. And for the EU, if the EU's bureaucratic arrangements are helping it serve its political and also normative and other objectives. And this is not just for the EU, this is also for the UN. So all of these big entities that go on with a lot of political inertia, but also a lot of financial inertia, but are also structured in a certain way. And sometimes the bureaucracy reinforces and allows you to deliver on these political objectives, social objectives, and sometimes is the barrier. And clearly speaking, in this case, it is a bit of a barrier. I mean, part of the reason why the EU is forced to cut, or the EU delegation in Somalia, for example, would be forced to cut these chunks into, or cannot channel these resources into smaller funds, is because you don't have then people who would be able to manage all of these 10 and 15 projects. So you'd rather give it to one or two organizations, they will manage it, you do your financial monitoring, that's it, you're happy. And now that we are at the global level, talking about restructuring development aid itself, and now that we all seem to agree at the point of principle that the money should indeed go to the entities or the citizens or the communities that we say we are serving, I think this model of one has to partner with international organizations to tap onto these resources is fundamentally flawed. It works for now, but that shouldn't be the model. The model should be to deconstruct that, so that the bureaucracy is amended to some extent, so that direct channeling of finances could be done. And part of it is, like a trust issue, but part of it is a mentality issue as well. And part of it is just devising tools, effective tools. Have we done piloting of, are there some modalities that would happen in some foundations, which have, of course, different accountability measures than the EU, or governments which give out development aid, are piloting that. And I think there's a lot to learn from each other in this arena, although it's a political discussion at the end. Now, to just round up, so this is the bureaucracy, but at the political level, I think there's already, to be honest, an appreciated a process or a level of political commitment internationally that should be appreciated, that has been put into establishing the federal government, at least in Somalia. So I think that's good. But the other thing, and this is not just unique to Somalia, of course, the context in Somalia is very complex, not only because the national politics in Somalia is complex, but also because of the regional importance of Somalia, the global importance of Somalia also, geopolitically speaking. So the interests on Somalia are not just, will never potentially, I mean, just to be direct, will never be determined by Somalis only. I mean, there's no geopolitically important entity or regionally important entity whose players are purely national. It just doesn't exist. So this will potentially continue. But I think there's something to be said about process, you know, establishing peace, reconstructing a state, reestablishing and reconstructing a broken economy or an economy that is, you know, evolving. A lot of it takes time and resources, and we should really step back from the temptation to achieve the end, so that we say, "Tada, you know, we've achieved it," while foregoing the importance of the process in between. So I think there needs to be some level of humility and some level of appreciation for the complexity of achieving peace anywhere, you know, much less in Somalia, and giving the process equal importance as the end itself. But that's a mental shift, you know, that's a mental shift, but I think we need to walk away with that.
Can I just 20
Quick
seconds,
intervention, yes.
20 seconds to say, I think we will go in the wrong direction, talking about quantity and not quality. I mean, again, I reiterate the importance of governance to attract, but it's not a problem of lack of money, it's how effective you are with the money.
Yeah. But I think Lidet mentioned the whole range of other issues as well, which are important for the discussion. The diversification of funding, the direct channeling, the trust element, the time element, the humility elements, the lessons that could be learned maybe from foundations, and have some foundations over here which are having a different way of working, sometimes more flexible than some of the bilateral and multilateral donors. Maybe this is a question as last intervention to this panel, because then we go into the questions, and please think about your questions, also the people in the virtual audience. We still have half an hour then for some very concrete questions to the panelists. But before we do this, maybe Stijn can also a little bit expand on his own experiences. You have not only been to Somalia, you're just back from PRC, you have been traveling to so many African countries. What is it that the international community can do in a context of scarcity of resources, where there's a lot of signs of hope, where there's a lot of dynamics, particularly amongst the younger generations, women, and so on? What are the factors from your perspective that should be given absolutely more attention at this very moment to support these processes? It's not maybe only a factor of money, but of other types of support. What are your lessons of experience?
Well, sorry, let me start with what Dr. Mukwege said, one of your predecessors who got the prize you will have in 2 days. And we talked to him only 2 days ago. And he was talking on the Eastern Congo. He was asking himself, is there a difference between the suffering of the Eastern Congolese people and the suffering of the Ukraine people? If you see how much money could be provided for military and humanitarian help for Ukraine here in Europe, also from the European Union, and the difference between how much money is going to Eastern Congo, how much military cooperation is going to Eastern Congo, who is also invited by a neighboring country. The same can be said about Somalia. In 2000, or after the famine in 2011, there was a promise that this could never happen again. What has been done with structural problems like drought-resilient agriculture? Everybody knew that there would be more La Niñas being the reason for drought we see now. Was there enough attention for Somalia between the emergency crises and now there is an emergency crisis, there is money that is distracted from the Horn of Africa to Ukraine, not necessarily from the European Union, but there are countries that changed the destination of their money. So even after 2 years of warning for this situation, warning started in December 2020, were repeated several times. The reaction is as slow as in 2011. And we will have to have a famine declaration before the emergency is clear to my view. So this, I am talking now about an emergency situation. I know that the organizations, local organizations in Somalia, one of Ilwad, have to work with the government and can't also always rely on aid from our support and donors from outside Somalia, and that government has to work with them and they have to work with the government and so on. But now we're talking about an emergency situation and people already dying. And now what's needed is trust in the local organizations, no time for bureaucracy, and providing help, supplies, and money, more money. That is I think what is needed to save lives, and then finally after that work on structural solutions, because more droughts will come to Somalia, much more droughts. Somalia is one of the most climate affected countries in the world.
Thank you. Quick reaction, Ilwad?
Yes, I mean, I definitely support the very strong appeal that you made. I think that there needs to be immediate support to the humanitarian crisis that we're facing right now in Somalia. And when you work with local partners, you can actually go to the most acute and most affected areas. And I think that that is definitely something that I wanted to echo, but we are also in Somalia at the nexus of environmental degradation that is cyclical, almost like clockwork, every 5 years, and also the intrinsic link of armed conflict and climate change in Somalia. In fact, the only UN climate change and security advisor is posted in Somalia. Just a few weeks ago, we launched a report that Elman Peace contributed to for the last 2 years that has an empirical evidence base on the linkage between climate change and armed conflict, where we see groups like al-Shabaab burning farms, poisoning water wells, increasing the vulnerability of already vulnerable members of the society and forcing them to join their armed groups. So when we look at structural long-term solutions to environmental issues, we need to also reframe what that looks like in the EU or global North picture of climate change. It's not something that we're going to invest in for our future children or the next generation. It's happening now. It's an imminent threat. We have two twin crises: global security crisis and the crisis of the biosphere. And it's manifesting in different ways in different parts of the world. And having this posting now in Somalia is useful because there's now an opportunity to actually begin to engage and look at the armed conflict as the final effect of the resource scarcity that keeps happening. So I definitely echo that we need to just stop the wound right now, which is what's happening, the death, the famine, and respond with financial resources. And then also start to think about how to prevent and prepare and plan.
We'll all be given 2 minutes at the end.
Two very quick ideas. First, contrary to what happened in the past, humanitarian aid now is also subject to instrumentalization. Look at what happened between Addis and Tigray. Second idea, again, in the 90s, during the Restore Hope operation, the first crisis in Somalia, I was there, by the way, as a humanitarian worker, there was plenty of resources. those resources, in fact, created the problem and encouraged the internal conflict. So do not forget this point.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nicolas. With this, I turn to this audience here and also the virtual audience. Please put your questions. Maybe you can also directly put your question to one of the panelists or to several of the panelists. And not only questions, of course, if you would have specific observations, personal impressions, don't hesitate. I see already a rise of hands. Make yourself known so that everybody knows who is who. Yes, please.
Thank you, Geert. I'm Mr. Baruti from Democratic Republic of Congo, but I'm based in Belgium, working in peace building through an African NGO. I don't have a question, but some comments on the presentation of Madame Ilwad. First, we should not neglect that Somali now represents a big market, informal market, big informal market. You spoke about scarcity, but the scarcity is for official, but informally there are so many people who rich in informal business. My proposal is to through the European Fund and not under the channel, try to conceive a kind of training on management and business, small management, small enterprise, in addition to the work that Ilwad is doing. What I propose that, because 10 years ago, when they proposed a kind of amnesty to people involved in the piracy, just after that, they said, "Oh, we don't arrest, but we push them to get involved in the shallow." Most of them became the chief of enterprise, the tourism. They built hotels, and many medium hotels in Somalia belong to other the people who were involved in the piracy. Maybe there are people in a young army group who want also to become a manager or officer, but they don't have minimum capacity for managing enterprise, for making profit. I propose that try to explore that aspect. The first one. The second one is the rationale that Madame Lidet noticed the geographic position of Somalia. There are people in the Lebanon, Gulf countries. There are people in Kenya. There are people in the Central African Republic and the eastern part of Congo who have connection with Somali people, because it's the way they export the goods informally through the Indian Ocean. So when we spoke about Shabaab, we used to present Shabaab as criminal, but in the business, Shabaab are a good business. It's surprising, but it's true. If you deal with Shabaab in the business, informal business, you cannot expect to be disappointed. That is the way the ambassador thought. It's a very complex and complicated situation in Somalia. So let's try to be more pragmatic, and I think we can find a solution, because last month the former president of Somalia tried to travel here to see the president Tshisekedi to try to find the solution before the election. That means that Somalia themselves are sitting in the formal position. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for these observations. We will ask Ilwad and maybe also her colleagues and others to react later on. We take another observation question. Ambassador Black, please.
Yes, Thank you very much. And thank you for the panel for your very nice presentations and giving us an insight for those of us who have never been to Somalia. My name is Miriam Black. I am the ambassador of Uganda, accredited to the Benelux countries and the EU. And of course, I think I would like to address my question to Ilwad. Congratulations already as a laureate and your team. We are very proud of you, and please, way to go. I think this is only a stepping stone to your center being more recognized internationally and may serve as an example to many other countries. Because you are living there, I was wondering whether you could help me to enlighten myself and my thoughts about peace, lasting peace in Somalia. As you know, we as Uganda, we have, I think up to now still about 7,000 or 8,000 troops. And thank you to the EU for having assisted us to basically look for African solutions to African problems, but with some finance from the EU, most of it. I had the feeling that, of course, Mr. Baruti talked about it, al-Shabaab. I talk to regularly our generals who are on the ground. One is my colleague who's a deputy ambassador in Mogadishu, and they have been here for the discussions on transformation of Somalia, invited by the EU. What is your view, or what is the general view? How do people perceive al-Shabaab? Because let me tell you something that had happened very recently, I think about 2 months ago. The intention for us is to pull out, definitely. I mean, we can't be there forever. We've been there for 14 years. That's a long time, and we lost a lot of people, some hundreds died, Ugandans. So the thing is, we want to reduce our troops. And when we then want, because we've trained Somali people in police and in army, but the issue is that when we handed over a piece that was previously be controlled by us, within 24 hours, it was overtaken by al-Shabaab. Now, I wondered how come that it happened, but it also makes me to realize, can we ever leave? Are we going to be another MONUSCO like in the DRC? I wanted to have your views, because maybe if al-Shabaab is so much around, maybe there's a need to bring them in. I don't know what your views are, but it has to be clarified to me. Thank you.
Let's ask directly to Ilwad, because this is quite a delicate question, I could well imagine.
And I think this is a question that I also invite my colleagues, our executive director, to respond to as well too. But when we look at the number of people that are actively within al-Shabaab, a very small number. I think we're looking at 5,000, 6,000 individuals. So the fight to build lasting peace is not just a military solution. We know you can't bomb ideology. We know that even if al-Shabaab didn't exist today, another group could emerge. And we've seen splinter factions. It could not be a terrorist organization, it could be a drug organization or whatever. I don't think AMISOM or the peacekeeping troops' role is to fight off al-Shabaab, and it's to build the capacity of the Somali National Armed Forces, to equip them with the resources they need, and to have a transition that is already now being in process, that actually builds the capacity of the military, the political infrastructure behind that, and the strategy and the planning, but then also makes an inclusive process. There have been more than 15 peace agreements in Somalia over the years, 13 to 15, I think. And these processes need to be inclusive. And when I say inclusive, I don't mean just have a token young person there, have a woman at the seat, have credible actors. There's a massive trust deficit in Somalia. So even if when you're trying to build peace, the people who are brokering it, who are negotiating it, who are mediating it, like we heard from Ambassador Nicholas also say that insider mediation and directly engaging with communities, there's so many more possibilities that I think that are not being explored. And this links to the question that the gentleman asked as well too, that lasting peace is possible when we also invest in the wider environment and we're not just looking at the individual perpetrator. And military operations, I think, are very exclusive. There needs to be security sector reform. There's been progress, but significant regress as well too. I'll give you an example on the amnesty that you brought up as well too. Those that have most blood on their hands are incentivized to leave the group with hope that they'll make a statement and, you know, encourage other people to leave. But children are being executed without any due process, without any formal representation or anything. Children and young people with least decision-making power. So then comes the question of how can you even promote trust building between security forces and leaving these groups and creating peace when it's not fair. And there needs to be true and localized reconciliation. We're building a glass house where we're talking about peace building in Somalia, but there's deeply rooted historical tensions. And when you are essentially rewarding people with houses and leaving the country just because they held an influential role in groups like al-Shabaab, but killing children that were either forcefully recruited, the message that you're sending is not one that's going to unite communities. And so I really do believe that peace is within reach in Somalia. And a recent example of that is during this budding political tensions and political violence that we're having leading up to the elections that we just had, where the opposition groups were actually mobilizing young men that have political aspirations, that wanted to be president. We're mobilizing people from their tribe and telling them, okay, if the past president does not get out of the state house, we will forcefully take him out, even if it means burning entire Mogadishu down. We had young people that are in our program telling us, like, what has the government ever done for me? At least now I get to go to restaurants, I get to walk down the street. If I participate in this, I'm just contributing to deconstructing the little bit of stability that we have. So there's changes happening in critical thinking, in access to information, and people wanting desperately to transition out, but they need to be a part of the process. And we heard from Lidet that we need to work with the systems that are also indigenous and traditional to the community. We often talk about clan elders, but we don't talk about how within the clans, there's also youth, like designated trusted leaders within each tribe, sub-tribe. If someone gets killed and they're from a tribe, a young person that's the leader of that goes to broker it, raises money. There's so many practices that are not being utilized, but the transition needs to be one that is localized, inclusive, and leverages experiences from all fields. And a military solution alone cannot build peace in Somalia.
Thank you. Thank you. Think about other questions, because I have a few virtual questions. And one of the virtual questions is, or questions from the people in the virtual audience. I have a question from Omar Garcia to Ambassador Berlanga. And the question is, how can the EU ensure that regional programming in the Horn of Africa has more of a gender approach? Is there room for a regional Team Europe initiative on gender in the Horn of Africa? That's a question from Omar Garcia. And there's a second question from Mr. Hassan Abdikafi Moalim. Why are most of EU funding projects not prioritized? It's for me not entirely clear what is meant by this, but maybe Mr. Hassan can still explain this. But in the meantime, Ambassador Berlanga, the first question. So a very different nature, this question, than the questions that were put earlier to Ilwad, but feel free to also come in on that question that was put by Ambassador Black. Eh?
Yeah, I think if you allow me, I will start by that, say first, al-Shabaab, we cannot analyze al-Shabaab outside the struggle for powers in Somalia, in this case at local level. And you can see how easy sometimes local leaders, elders from local communities, change allegiances. from al-Shabaab to the government because of. So more effective presence of institutions throughout the country may help. Totally in agreement to what it was said about military solution is not the only, it will never happen. There is something else. I think we were all expecting this moment in now after the president's election to see whether with the new administration, with 4 years in front of us, that. And second thing, very important issue that you mentioned, impunity. Whatever happens in the future, there are people that have their hands full of blood. I used to say in a more fictional way that sometimes I look at the people to see whether there is still rest of blood. So that impunity is very essential. We saw a couple of years ago something dramatic. A gentleman that created a lot of problems at one moment reached an agreement with the government and was treated as a hero. And what about the community that were displaced because of all the people died? I did a tweet. I don't know whether you remember that. It was a very risky one, but it came from my side. We couldn't input. Regional team leader initiative. Well, first of all, we should ask ourselves, is there a region in the Horn of Africa? The key element of peace for the region is traditionally Ethiopia. So unfortunately, for the last couple of years, has not been able to provide kind of stability for the region. So whatever we think about regional or look at the situation in Sudan, let's do not talk about Eritrea. So we need to put that into context. Whether there will be a Team Europe initiative, I don't know. I don't know, of course. As EU have in our agenda the regionalization. So whatever will be done in this, I think about prioritization, well, maybe Mr. Hassan will explain later.
Yes, I have in the meantime another question for you, and then I go to the other panelists. A question by Andrea Dinka. How would the newly established financial instrument of the EU, the European Peace Facility, impact the EU's engagement in Somalia? For those who are not insiders, the Africa Peace Facility has been replaced by a European Peace Facility that is now also operational in Ukraine. How will this affect the relationship between the European Union and Somalia?
Well, normally it should influence in a positive way, but who knows? We are just at the beginning, because the African Peace Facility was funded under the European Commission. It means it cannot fund, for example, lethal equipment, and there were a lot of limits. Now these limits do not exist anymore with the European Peace Facility. But again, we should see that in practice. But normally it should have a positive influence, supporting former AMISOR, as Ambassador said, and now supporting people at
maybe an observation that I would like to give also from the virtual audience. Abdirashid Ahmed, as Ambassador Nicolas Berlanga said, one of the key barriers preventing local entities from working with the EU is their limited capacity for fund management. And that's what you had indicated. However, the number of Somali entities capable of managing over 1 million euros has increased lately, particularly in the development sector. Is the EU prepared to have meaningful partnerships with local entities? I think you gave already an answer to that. So, but it's an observation by Mr. Abdirashid Ahmed.
Maybe what we should precise is that, again, in a very private-oriented society as Somalia, money has an influence, or the use of money may disrupt communities. So it is not only a question of money, that's what I'm saying. It's a question also of well-rooted association or institutions that are able to manage in a fair way, benefiting the whole.
Thank you. And then I turn to Lidet, a question by Mrs. Katarina Miliazes, also in the virtual audience. Following up on what Lidet was suggesting on providing direct funding to local organizations, what is the risk for funders of engaging with GONGO? And GONGO stands for Government Organized Non-Governmental Organizations. What is the risk of for funders of engaging with Gongos in Somalia? Is that a legitimate reason why international funders are averting direct funding to local organizations?
Very quickly, I would say I don't think so, because these same entities also do fund governments at the end. So it's not like they have a completely anti-government stance. However, I do understand the concern, especially if the concern is these governmental or like the organizations, governmental organizations camouflaging as CSOs, fronting themselves, number one, to shrink and to surveil on other CSOs, or if it is to tap into more financial resources. I mean, all of these things exist and they are valid concerns. But I guess it also has to do with context. For example, in Sudan and in Ethiopia, before the political changes that happened in these countries, you did not have any other entity than party-affiliated entities or government-affiliated entities that were providing socio-economic services or providing some, political, social movements. And we didn't have any space of civil society to speak of, especially when it came to governance-related, peace-building-related, human rights-related work. So in this case, I think if the objective is not to make a normative statement, but to actually do meaningful act, one would always have to do with the very small space that exists. One would also have to take due diligence for sure, and this requires a lot of understanding of context. That's why, this idea of working on complex settings by sitting in Berlin is not a very good idea. You have to partner with, you have to develop contextual knowledge of what is happening, and the people that are based there, they know, they know who's who and what is possible with whom, and that is sort of the kind of thing they bring. So for me, is that the reluctance, does that come from there? In my observation, no. I think it really does come from also the historical and the political baggage that the development industry itself is rooted in. I mean, there's no escaping it, I think. If you will let me, can I react to?
2 minutes. You just wait a little bit.
Okay.
If you wait a little bit, there's a few more questions or observations that, first of all, the same person who has put this question to you is also, thanks to the panelists for the great insights. But then there is an observation. We could still take a few questions from the audience here. If there are a number of burning questions, I see Rob Kozelj. Please present yourself and put your question. And then I let the people react here in this panel in final 2-minute reactions. Please, Rob.
Thank you very much. My name is Rob Kozel. I work for the European External Action Service, Africa 1 Division. First of all, I would like to sincerely thank to all of you for your intervention. A special thanks to Ilwad for your passionate expose of what you are doing, extremely important. I will not enter in detail on the situation in Somalia because my colleague Nicholas already very well preceded me. I would like just to make perhaps a general remark in order also to answer to your initial name and how can perhaps the EU better support local embedded initiatives. I believe that the key here is in communication, in exchange of information, in involvement, in getting on board all the stakeholders, all the actors. I mean, in the European institution, when you work for one of them, your added value is also in trying to put together all the actors that can be potentially involved, in the sense that everyone come to us and ask us what do we think and how should we do, and we receive a lot of good advice and we receive a lot of good information. I believe that we could exploit this good information that we receive to also put this information forward in the right moment to the right actors, and in this way to build bridges among those actors in order to enable them to act in a stronger and in a more unified manner. And I will make an example. At the eve of the AU-EU 6th summit that took place, of course, in Brussels in February, we were contacted by a real big variety of actors. And what I saw was potentially our main added value there was to put also themselves in the contact among themselves and to try to promote a cooperation between these actors, among those actors, in as far as civil society is concerned, in as far as think tanks are concerned, and you know very well that they're having a very good cooperation this very moment, in as far as the youth dimension is concerned. And here we don't have to forget that 70% of African people are very young. So when we speak about partnership with Africa, we speak in premise, I believe, about the partnership with the young people. So what we can do and what we are doing is to build bridges, to promote contacts, to give them the right information in the right moment in order to make them strong. And I believe that in this sense, the help of the support of think tanks, of the European Policy Center, of ECDPM and ETTG, for example, was great in promoting and in sharing the right information. And I would just like to tell you that we would like to continue in this way. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Rock, for these encouraging words. I see that we are running a little bit out of time, so I would like to ask our panelists to have some final reactions, some final takeaways, very short. What is it that you retain from this debate? What are some of the lessons that you would like to take home? Let's start with Stijn.
Thank you. I asked myself, when we're talking about Somalia, and definitely me, do we understand Somalia well enough? The complex situation and the system, like Ilwad was explaining very well, that you have clans, subclans, families, like I think there's a Somali proverb that ends with me against my clan, me against my family, me against my brother, who what is showing a little bit of this complexity. So do we, as European institutions and international institutions, and we Western journalists, do we know enough of this Somalian complexity, and don't we have to give more trust to this local organization like yours, who is knowing this complexity very well? We are also, and journalists do it a lot, talking about Somalia as a failed state. But as I was there, I saw the state is functioning in many ways, like the mobile money, changing the people paying with mobile money. I think Somalia has one of the best mobile money services in the world. And there are a lot of other examples that are working very, very good in Somalia because they do it themselves. They have tried to find way beneath the structure that is existing and failing from time to time. But my end remark will be on the emergency situation. I did a report on the famine in 2011. And one of the things I will remember for the rest of my life was talking with a family who was resting under a tree, coming from Somalia, just entered Kenya on their way to Dadaab. And they were telling me how they were walking for 3 weeks already, and they had to take a very hard choice a few days ago. They left behind, because they were lacking food, they left behind the weakest of the group, and that were 5 children. They left them behind under a tree and walked further. After 2 days, they found some food, and 2 of the fathers went back to get the children. But at the time they arrived at the place where they left the children, they were all died and eaten by hyenas. This story was told me in a way almost without emotions, because the emotions were wiped away by the crisis. And this was what famine meant to me. They didn't bury their children anymore. They didn't, because all these social norms, that they all faded away because of the famine, because of the hunger. Exactly that is happening again. I was hearing some others telling some same stories as they came from the countryside to Baidoa to find help, and how they lost 3 children on the way, or even 3 children in Baidoa because of sickness due to the hunger. So please, we can think in our think tanks and think about structure in our European institutions, and that's a good thing. But what's needed right now is emergency help for Somalia, because we're heading for a new famine, and I can't believe that this is happening in 2021, a famine. So I hope the attention goes to that emergency situation in Somalia as well.
It's a very tragic message, Stijn. Lidet, your final observations.
You know, I have a peace building background. So when we talk about Somalia or any other conflict affected setting, in general, we say, or there's this rule of thumb that for every year of violent conflict, you would need around 10 years of reconstruction and peace building. And if I were to, look at Somalia and how far the country has come, and that it's only maybe after 2010, 2012, where things have stabilized a bit and where some people have been able to come back. I feel like that's a progress that needs to be appreciated. And a lot remains to be done. But Somalia is not like this unique case in the history of the world that has undergone years of civil conflict, but also that has taken its time in the way to reconstruction. Now, having said that, the thing that I wanted to say is, beyond Somalia, if we also look at the region, if there is such a thing as the Horn of Africa region, I would sort of maybe say that indeed Ethiopia was an important actor in the region, but we shouldn't. Maybe we should distinguish between Ethiopia as a security exporter and Ethiopia as a peace exporter, because in a way, peace itself goes beyond states. States are very important, no questions, but it goes beyond states. And if you look at people and communities, the Horn of Africa is one of those integrated societies. I mean, the Somalis you have in Ethiopia, you have in Kenya, you have in Somalia itself. So there are so many interlinkages, and I wonder if we were able to build bridges, not just between states, but also non-state actors and citizens, so that we also overcome some of our historical tensions and narratives that we have of each other. That if we were able to, as people, also imagine some sort of new future. I mean, our future could be very different from the past of our parents, but I don't think we've had that opportunity. I mean, maybe social media is changing that a bit because we interact with each other a bit more. But I wonder, what could be achieved if some of our interventions and actions were regional, but focused on non-state actors and businesses and people. So that's what I would keep with.
Thank you, Lidet. I turn to Nicolas, and then I give the final word to Ilwad. Nicolas.
Okay, thank you. 2 minutes. First, I totally agree with what you said. Societies run in parallel to institutions and to governments and problems they have. And it is true that borders do not represent too much to societies. I mentioned Somalis, and this is the real strength, in my opinion, of this part of the world. And the challenge probably would be too much, how we can at one moment help to match both of them. About Somalia. Somalia is a world society, it's a global nation. Whenever you see a Somali, it will be a Somali, even if he's in South Africa, in the Gulf countries, in UK, in the United States, it's a global society. And every Somali thinks about Somalia. And they have an enormous amount of expertise. I don't think that Somalia lacks expertise in all the fields. Having said that, also, Somalia managed to reach some kind of, again, basic stability in terms of security and political stability, Somalia probably will be one of the few African countries or one of the few developing countries that will not need international help. By themselves, they will go. Even in terms of money, I mean, there are a lot of very wealthy Somali people. And I will end with a proverb, which I think it is a very good way to end with a proverb, Somali proverb. Somali proverb which says, when you want a goat, ask for a camel. So the question here is, please do not focus too much on money. Sorry, I am not talking about the famine or emergency. I totally agree with you on this dramatic issue. But in general terms, do not focus too much on quantity, let's talk quality. Government.
Thank you. Ilwad, you have the final word. We have been listening to many panelists. I see that there's even more questions coming in, which we can't answer at this very moment, but your final observations after this panel discussion.
And I'll keep them brief as well too, because I know we're over time, but really, I think that this was a very interesting and frank dialogue about Somalia. And hopefully this is just the beginning of a conversation about keeping Somalia on the EU's radar, especially where we are right now. Some key things that I want to highlight is, one, there are changes happening. It's not the same kind of environment anymore, where before local grassroots organizations would get funding and would just say, it's too dangerous to visit this area, and there would be no opportunities for M&E, for visiting. There's digital technology, there's oversight as possible from a distance and also physically. So the trust element of trusting local actors to actually deliver on those results that they get funding for, it's possible. There aren't any barriers there. Secondly, I served for 2 years on the UN Peacebuilding Fund Advisory Board under the Secretary General for fragile and conflict-affected states. And during my time there, the fund became open to civil society organizations. But, so that's progress again as well too, where before it was only exclusively available to UN agencies. But the barriers and the structures and the challenges for the requirements are still too difficult for local organizations, even the ones that have the greatest capacity to apply, or having that reserve of funds in your account. So there are positive examples, again, that the EU supports, of approaches where local organizations can get access to funds. And it would be remiss for me not to point out our colleagues and our partners at EIP, who we have a consortium with, where, you know, they take on some of the administrative and fiscal burden, I call it. And we are able to lead the intervention, implementation, direction, strategy of the work in country. And we also have another partner that helps the communication called the African Voices Foundation. And this is an EU-supported program. So consortiums that actually leverage expertise from different areas, it's not a problem, but it should also transfer capacity so that one day local organizations can, if they so want to carry this burden, be able to manage those funds. I also want to say that our work in Somalia on community-based reintegration has been extensively reviewed, and with EU support, Bernadette Academy, UNDP, we've been able to scale it through a network called Peace by Africa. And support organizations in Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, Chad, Uganda, Rwanda, DRC. A country that's considered a failed state is now having a best practice that can help newer and emerging conflicts to not protract. So there is progress happening. And now, finally, again, shifting to developing new frameworks, new guidances for the context that we live in, informed by the local community. And so there are things to celebrate. And I wanted to end this panel also on a positive note, because it's very easy to agonize, but very difficult to organize. And I think that all of us are speaking the same language, that this needs to be an inclusive, holistic approach. And Somalis that are not part of civil society or organizations want to be involved as well too. So it needs to be opened up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilwad, and thank you to the panel for a very interesting discussion. I think we touched upon a whole range of issues. I'm not going to synthesize at this stage. I definitely retain that there is an immediate urgency. I think that story that the journalist amongst the panelists here in the table told us is a very important one. But there's also the whole story, the longer term story of hope, which is very encouraging. There's a whole range of dynamics, local dynamics, youth, young generations, change processes that are at this moment taking place in Somalia, and that also needs support, not always in terms of quantities of resources, but maybe also with all types of other inputs. And I think this is the takeaway message that we all have: work on the short term, but definitely invest also in the long term, because the future is quite promising. And I think all of us concord in that analysis. Thank you very much for having organized this event. I would like to thank particularly Kathleen of ECDPM, together with the King Baudouin Foundation and EPC, the European Policy Center, who did also a wonderful effort to give us these fantastic facilities here. And I hope that we can retain some key messages from this meeting, and that we can definitely continue the type of discussions on Somalia at the moment that Europe is very much caught into the discussions on Ukraine. There is also a need to continue these discussions because they are also very urgent. Thanks a lot, Ilwad and panelists. Well done.